Hey, hello, welcome or welcome back. If you're ready to talk about books, it is a rainy spring day in Chicago, so it is the perfect time to wrap up March reading. And I had a surprisingly, in some ways, really satisfying March, which is great. That is always the aim of a reading month. I read a lot of really great and surprising books. So I'm excited to go into all of them now, especially as a decent number of them I haven't talked about yet. Starting with You Dreamed of Empires by Alvaro Enrique and translated by Natasha Wimmer. I alluded to the fact that we would be talking about this while mentioning the new V. Castro book coming out this month in the anticipated releases video, and I was incredibly excited about this book because I read Sudden Death when I was a bookseller and remembered how just odd it was, and I love odd fiction, but I at the time very much considered Sudden Death and Samantha Schweblin's Fever Dream similarly in terms of them being just very abstract, odd, slightly funny, more on the side of Sudden Death than Fever Dream narrative. So I was very, very excited to be getting another narrative, another novel from Enrique that also seemed to be in conversation with our conception of history, and in this case, the conception of Hernan Cortez and the Aztecs and the fall of the Aztec Empire. And here it is almost hard. I wish I were smarter, because if I were smarter, we could have done a full feature Friday on this, and I would have loved to be able to dig into this more. But alas, I am not, in that I don't think that I'm going to be able to fully articulate everything that is going on in this book, though I don't think you need to be able to, and I don't want to scare you off of the book by any means because it is very enjoyable. But the You Dreamed of Empires, the dream part is very important here because we are kind of viewing this narrative through an altered state of sorts, and the way this narrative is able to invoke senses is really satisfying and sometimes a little bit on the edge, but we have the sense of the absurdity of everything here. And there is definitely an absurdist angle to how this is approaching the history, very much comedic at times, while also prefacing real horrors, but making caricatures of both of these powers in some ways and kind of eliciting the absurd of the historical record and pushing things to the extreme in order to elicit that response and to remind us that the people in power and were deciding the fates of empires and the peoples therein, that to a certain extent they were just kind of bumbling around. And I just was really intrigued by the way that this was exploring the history and the power structures, and the way especially that the Spanish were underestimating the power structures of this place they were walking into. And I appreciated the willingness, especially on the side of the portrayal of the conquistadors, to really complicate the romanticization of imperialism, and we present these men that are unhygienic, crude, that they have kind of either bought on to this expedition or they have been chased out of their home for bad behavior or this, that, and the other. So even removing what we know of the outcome of this meeting, we have this more complicated kind of comedic look at them where we are in some ways poking fun, but it's in some ways poking fun at empires and bureaucracy on both sides and the ideas that kind of live and perpetuate systems of power. And so again, I'm not smart enough to fully unpack everything, and the kind of correlation between this kind of drug-induced dream that we are kind of wading through with this and the way that that could be drawing a correlation with power and the idea that power is a hallucination of some kind, this construct is a hallucination of some kind. I don't really know how to fully unpack that idea, but there was just so much to explore in this book and to think about, while the packaging again had this absurdist tone, this comedic tone, things you don't typically associate with such serious subject matter, but I really appreciate the perspective of this book. I did also appreciate the author's note at the beginning in terms of the translation and pronunciation. I know that I was not able to fully grasp all of the pronunciation of the book, but I appreciate that that was there so I could think about vowel sounds and this and that and the other differently, since I don't have a lot of expertise in grasping onto new languages, so I liked that that was at the front of the book so I could kind of center myself before entering the narrative, but I don't think that that distracts from the narrative at any point either. So mostly I would just love to hear your thoughts on this if you've read it. And I wish I could provide more profound thoughts and fully unpack this for you, but alas, you are just gonna have to read it for yourself. And then I listened to My Once and Future Duke by Carolyn Linden because I am trying to be better about listening to all of my backlogged audiobooks that I have snapped up on sale at some point or another. And this is a romance that had the promise of a gaming hell in some form, which explains why I snapped it up in the first place, and because I have enjoyed Carolyn Linden in the past. But our protagonist, Sophie, is a gambler of sorts. She went to boarding school. She is the granddaughter of a peer, but she has basically been cut off, and since her parents are gone, she has to strive to make her way in the world by herself. And seeing a woman making her way in the world by herself, especially in a romance like this, is incredibly interesting. And the way she is doing that is through gambling. And it's a really fine line she has to walk in terms of managing and maintaining her respectability on top of everything, especially as she is garnering attention at this gaming hell. Unfortunately, this puts her in the path of the brother of our hero, Jack, and Jack is not super happy about the gambling debts his brother has been accumulating, and he goes to the establishment to try and sort things out himself, get a full sense of the damage done and whatnot. Unfortunately, while there, he sees his brother gambling by chance and circumstance with Sophie. Sophie has not invited these intentions, and yet she finds the full ire of the Duke directed at her. And part of this ire is surely because he is, of course, instantly attracted to her. And so this leads him to making a bet with Sophie. And the outcome of this bet, if he wins, would be he gets her company for a week. Scandalous for sure. And so this ends up happening, and he basically whisks her off, though they then have to play it off when they come back to town that he didn't actually whisk her off, because it does very much ruin her reputation if that is what happened, which it was. But more real feelings develop in this weak way, despite the fact that there are things keeping them apart that they have to face upon return to town, and things kind of spiral, including Sophie's reputation being at risk because the Duke's brother keeps gambling, spoiler alert, and things become more complicated, especially as people start to question whether Sophie really was sick for that entire week. I don't know, I loved the idea of the forced proximity of this. It felt super adjacent to like a forced marriage or a marriage of convenience, but in a way that didn't work for me fully, because it was him whisking her away without any thought to her reputation. And for someone who had such strict morals in relation to gambling, it didn't fully make sense that he would kind of entertain his basest instincts in that moment. I did like some of the interactions when they were back in town, and the idea of Sophie like coming to him when his brother continues to give her attention, but ultimately this felt somewhat flat for me because most of the book was them in the country, and I just didn't really gel with how that was working. But that is also personal preference, and I am sad about it because by all accounts, this should have had everything I love in a romance, especially with the gaming hell setting, at least for part of the book. And I did like the way that we kind of explored that a little bit, the regulars, how Sophie kind of interacted with that space and the people there, and how she maintains that delicate balance in that setting. But alas, at the end of the day, this wasn't ultimately my favorite. And then I read The Foxwife by Yang Zi-Chu, which I did a Feature Friday on, so I won't dwell too long, but this is a kind of speculative, mythological, historical fiction set in China at kind of the dawn of the 20th century, and it is looking at a fox spirit and a detective as their two plot lines kind of merge together, or how fate in some ways brings them together, and our fox spirit is seeking revenge for the death of her child, and she ends up coming in contact with some more fox spirits from her past in this search at the same time as a detective is trying to find the identity of a woman who showed up dead in the doorway of a restaurant. And so it is just really interesting to see how these two storylines weave together. And I do think it does a good job at letting us, as the audience, kind of pick up ahead of the narrative. So it plants the seeds. It wants us to be on top of that, but it lets us get there first, which I find really fun. I enjoy being smarter every once in a while, even if I'm not, because it's carefully constructed to let me feel smarter. I also, as I mentioned in my Feature Friday, really appreciated its perspective on aging. But at the end of the day, the thing that really drew me to this book and was the highlight of the book for me was the portrayal of these fox spirits. I love a supernatural folklore angle, and these fox spirits were presented as kind of dangerous and seductive, but also mischievous, and the way that they kind of exist outside of time, but the way that industrialization and like modernity is catching up with that timelessness. As I said in the Feature Friday as well, this really appealed to me for some of the same reasons vampire fiction appeals to me, so that really worked. And this was the first time I got to interact with the idea of fox spirits in an adult setting, because I have read books in middle grade and young adult that explore that, which were both fantastic as well, but I really enjoyed an adult perspective on it, especially as we got to kind of look at a section of China that interacted with also Russia and Japan, and how we can see different myths exist in different regions. So really, really enjoyed this book. And then while it's hard because I read lots of wonderful, fantastic books this month, and I don't generally like picking favorites, I do think The Warm Hands of Ghosts by Catherine Arden was my favorite of the month, which is unexpected because it is a World War I narrative. Or maybe it is expected because the minute I say I'm not inherently drawn to an idea or a theme in fiction, I will inevitably love a book with that idea or theme shortly thereafter, and this is that book. But it does have things that I am inherently drawn to and attracted to in fiction in its speculative angle, so maybe it's not that much of a surprise after all. Additionally, I did love Catherine Arden's Bear and the Nightingale trilogy, and while this is set in a much different historical moment, in some ways there are similarities because both kind of settings are dealing with the idea of, again, modernity or change coming in some way. And I know this isn't super surprising because, especially in historical fiction, like, why are we placing something in a moment? There has to be something that we're exploring, some tension, some dramatic action, and change or disruption is the perfect exploration of that. But here we are in the midst of World War I. We are looking at it from a Canadian perspective, and so we are looking at the long haul of World War I, which I think is really an interesting and important perspective, and it deals with that long-term trauma, that long-term grief. I'm not going to dwell too long here because I again did a Feature Friday on it that I would encourage you to watch if you want to dig further into the book, but we are following our protagonist Flora, who is a discharged and honorably discharged decorated nurse who served on the front and was injured, as she has returned home, and then her brother Freddie, who is fighting on the front, has gone missing, potentially presumed dead, and she goes chasing answers. Meanwhile, we are seeing Freddie's perspective from a year prior, at least at the start of the novel, and watching him as he is dealing with the horrors of war and what that leads to. This is a really interestingly constructed novel. It bridges the ideas of reality and myth, the supernatural, kind of speculative bits super well in a way that makes sense and illustrates and articulates a lot of the horrors of war through a slightly abstracted lens that somehow makes that more clear in some ways. I don't know that that fully makes sense, but it makes sense in my head. So we'll go with it. But it also presents the front end war as a kind of purgatory of sorts, both through a Judeo-Christian lens and through like a Greek myth kind of lens. And so I was just very interested to see how everything kind of pieced together here. And ultimately, I just absolutely loved the voice, the lyricism of it, the way that the sorrow was there, but it was also so incredibly hopeful at the same time, and was exploring how we move past that horror into the hope. The World War I setting is also important to this because it's also exploring the idea of how senseless a lot of this feels and how that is a purgatory in and of itself, how you feel kind of removed in some ways, which is illustrated in certain parts from how the officers are removed from the daily lives of the soldiers and the nurses on the front, and other ways as well. And at the end of the day, I know I am in the minority in terms of World War I and World War II narratives not necessarily being one of the first things I'm attracted to in fiction. I know they are incredibly popular historical periods to explore, partly because it is a way to make sense of the senseless in some ways. So if that is you, I would highly encourage you to pick this book up. And even if that isn't you, I would highly encourage you to pick this book up, or at the very least, watch the full feature Friday to get a better sense of whether this is going to be for you or not. And then another book I would have loved to discuss in a feature Friday, but I don't know that even I have fully unpacked or where I have ultimately landed on my thoughts on it, but we're going to do our best to explore some of it here. Anniebot by Sierra Greer, which at the end of the day is essentially a Pygmalion retelling, but it follows a robot, Annie, who has been purchased to be the companion of her owner, Doug. And companion in the way you are most likely thinking. There are two modes for these robots. One of them is more like a housekeeper, caretaker for young children, what have you. The other is a more intimate companion, which is how Annie has been set. And we are getting the book through her point of view. Now, I listened to this on audio, and I don't know which way would be better. I haven't seen the book to see how it's laid out on the page, which I know sounds weird, but sometimes, especially with literary fiction, I don't know if maybe we have like smaller chunks of text or if we have like bigger walls of text in terms of how Annie's brain is working, how she's presenting things to us. I do think the audiobook is a good experience. However, it is a very short book. The audiobook I was listening to at more than one time speed, and it still took me a bit to get through because I needed to pause and take a break from it every once in a while for probably the reasons you're anticipating in relation to her relationship with Doug in particular, the portrayal of Doug in particular, and the fact that we were from Annie's perspective, and just how that was hard in terms of how she was objectified by the nature of the conceit, which again is on purpose. We're supposed to be uncomfortable. I think the narrative would be more concerned if we weren't uncomfortable, but at the end of the day, I have to try and sort my discomfort from what is supposed to be uncomfortable from what I think the book was ultimately saying. Again, it is a Pygmalion retelling, so there is that layer. But the end of it, I'm not sure. I was not sympathetic to Doug. I don't think the ending is asking me to be sympathetic to Doug, but I do think it is asking a question of whether Doug is redeemable or worthy of sympathy in some way. And I struggled because I like that we were trying to present a more complicated character there from the beginning, where it's a little bit more cut and dry. I also think that that is interesting as Annie is becoming more aware and more human-like in her perspective, even though she is still portraying things to us as a reader in a very matter-of-fact way in terms of relaying events. And she is conflicted on things, but I feel like at the beginning of the book as a reader, it is a much clearer perspective in terms of reaction to especially Doug than there is at the end when she is more sentient, for lack of a better word, nuanced in her reaction to the world. And I don't know how I feel about that. But at the same time, again, I don't think I'm supposed to be fully comfortable or comfortable at all in this narrative. And I do think it is a perfectly timed book. So I think there is a lot of cultural commentary and critique at play here that is very much of the moment we are in. But that being said, then the book is going to invoke those thoughts and explorations. And so as a reader, you ultimately have to decide if that is something you want to explore right now in your fiction. And I am not going to judge you either way for how you want to approach it, but just something to know. So a very intriguing book that is incredibly thought-provoking, and at the end of the day, I still don't really know how I feel about it. And then I also listened to Extremely Online, the second half of the title I'm going to read off, The Untold Story of Fame, Influence, and Power on the Internet by Taylor Lorenz, which I was very drawn to in similar ways to being drawn to books about the rise of YouTube and YouTubers back in like 2017, 2018, as I realized that I had really missed the rise of YouTubers and YouTuber personalities as a force. And so I, even though I grew up on the internet, don't know that I was always aware of like the big names in spaces that were influencing how the internet moved and grew in terms of how we interacted in social spaces online, which was really what this was focusing on. And it was at its heart an exploration on the evolution of the influencer, starting in kind of like the original Gossip Girl era and moving to kind of where we're sitting with TikTok influencers and YouTubers and Facebook all kind of competing for market share and attention, and how they are compensating personalities and influencers accordingly and what have you. And so in some ways it was a really interesting look at that evolution. It bridged some pieces together. In other places it felt a little bit more surface level, and maybe it just depended on what I already had a knowledge base of. I do think in some ways it may become dated over time as we kind of reconsider things, particularly from like the mommy blog chapter, as I think we are really looking at family and mom influencers in a different light, and the conversation has shifted pretty considerably just even in recent years. And so I do think it kind of maps out and gets down some important history, especially as history in the internet age, especially amongst things that happened on the internet, is a different kind of beast, and we don't really have a formalization of that record. But at the same time, I do think that the record is often more surface level than I think the author is capable of in the book, and that may just be appealing to the lowest common denominator in this form. I don't know, but I would have loved to see it push even further. But at the same time, I'm not saying it didn't push, and this is exactly the kind of social criticism, cultural criticism that I enjoy listening to, especially on audio. So I definitely think it is still well worth your time if you are interested. And then another read with a dedicated Feature Friday, we have Dead Things Are Closer Than They Appear by Robin Wassley. This is a young adult contemporary fantasy that's Buffy the Vampire Slayer meets The Rest of Us Just Live Here with a zombie apocalypse twist. It's got quirk, it's got heart, it has banter that is used, I personally think, very successfully as someone who loves banter, but sometimes feel like it does a lot of hiding of a lack of development in some instances. But here, it very much is used by our characters to kind of hide emotional vulnerabilities in some ways, and we are also kind of digging in to those vulnerabilities, and we are exploring the realities of those perceptions amidst, you know, trying to find our missing brother and save the town. So very fun. I did neglect to mention in my Feature Friday that, like A Tempest of Tea, it does have a couple of BTS references, though I did, of course, not forget to mention the Manatee reference. So I think this is a lot of fun. If you're at all interested, which you should be, go ahead and check out that Feature Friday for further exploration on this one. Next, I listened to Grief is for People by Sloane Crossley. This is my first interaction with Crossley's work, so I don't know how it fits within her prior body of work. I know she has some really well-received novels, but this really hit, and despite the absolutely devastating subject matter here, this was a really moving work. I went into it expecting a little bit more of a kind of broad swaths exploration of grief and kind of not self-help necessarily, but some action items or some ways that she has found successful in moving through grief framed by her own loss of a best friend, which, come to find out from the narrative, was a best friend that took their own life. So that is an extra layer of tragedy and trauma associated with that. And at the end of the day, it presented everything more through a kind of narrative of moving through the grief. I think the way it was constructed and framed was really well done. It started out with a home invasion and a robbery, and I didn't know exactly how that was going to fit into the framework that we were exploring here, and I think it was tied together so neatly. It also explored that kind of disassociation in some ways of grief and not really understanding, not reaching that acceptance yet because it hasn't fully processed. The emotional honesty, the rawness here, the way she described certain dreams involving this person that she lost, it all really felt true to her experience. I mean, it was her experience. The writing was gorgeous. At the end of the day, I don't know if I found methods to kind of sort through my own grief, though dulled, any differently, but I felt camaraderie in remembering that everyone really has lost and loved and lost and is moving through that grief in some way. And so it was just kind of like sitting next to someone going through something you have gone through. And so in that way, it really struck. I don't know how to fully encapsulate this book. And I think the saddest moments, because it doesn't ask us to wallow in sadness in quite the way you might expect, though I don't want to speak for your assumptions by any means. But the most devastating moments for me were just kind of the offhand recollections, the glimpses of a moment that spoke so much to a relationship or to a being without being any defining moment at the same time. I think that is where it worked the best for me. And I'm not saying the other parts didn't work, don't get me wrong, but that is what really struck me about this work. So yeah, I probably do need to revisit just to kind of look at the way everything was done here, but I have moved through that grief with Crossley already, and so I'm gonna just leave it at that for the moment. But if you've read it, I would be very interested to hear your thoughts, especially in terms of your expectations versus the reality of the book. So yeah, very interested in your thoughts there. And now for something completely different, we have the 4 romances I read for my March Madness adjacent project, where I read 4 mass market romances and faced them off against each other. So I'm not gonna spend too much time on any of these because I do have a rather long video diving into all of them, but the first was How to Be a Wallflower by Eloisa James, which is the first in her would-be wallflower series, and it involves an heiress and businesswoman who has come into town to meet a grandfather that she does not have a prior relationship with, and in the process ends up acquiring a costume emporium that was set to be bought out by an American businessman, the problem being they didn't know that that was going to mean moving to America as well, though this is not welcome news for our American businessman, Jake, who very much was set on that costumer as they are the best in the business and he has theaters to run. And so he moves into the same hotel that Cleo is staying in to try to persuade her to give up this emporium. And what starts off as some like friendly business banter and stakes turns a little bit more personal, and soon the game doesn't really have bite to it, but feelings are becoming involved that are complicated, especially by Cleo's past and the relationships with her mother and that her mother had and how that has impacted her. And so she has to decide if taking a chance on her heart is worth the risk, and Jake has to decide if taking a chance on his heart is worth the risk. Wallflower is ultimately lacking, but again, Cleo is attempting to present as a wallflower. She is not inherently a wallflower. And then we have The Duke Gets Desperate by Diana Quincy, which is her newest release and is the start of a series that I don't see any other books announced for yet. So I really need you to read this so that I can get more books in this series because I love Diana Quincy's voice and I really enjoyed this book. This follows our eponymous Duke Anthony after the death of his stepmother, who he is not mourning, to be completely honest. He is ready to gain back the title to his estate that his father had left to his stepmother after his death, and he needs to kind of revive the estate, the funds of the estate, etc. He then finds out that his stepmother has left his estate to her cousin, Rhea, who she has not even met, which he is understandably not super happy about. Rhea, meanwhile, has come off a disappointment in relation to her late father's business and being shut out of this business she has devoted so much time and heart to by her brother, a brother who was on her team for so long in relation to this business that it really is a betrayal for her. And so she now has a place to land in this estate, even if it is floundering. But in the floundering, she finds a purpose in trying to revitalize it and a business that she can own in some ways. And so her and Anthony butt heads, but there is also an incredible attraction there that does complicate matters at one point in the book. Shocker, I know, and things kind of spiral from there. This is a lot of, I really loved this book, so definitely check it out. I don't want to spoil too much more, but if you do want me to spoil at least a little more, check out my video talking about all of these romances. And then we have Tempest by Beverly Jenkins, which is a Western romance following mail-order bride Reagan as she is entering town to marry the Dr. Colton, but when her carriage is attacked by bandits on the way into town, she doesn't recognize a rescue party as a rescue party versus a second wave of bandits and shoots her future husband, which doesn't lead them to getting off on the right foot, but they inevitably come to a truce, especially because Colton really needs a mother figure for his daughter, but they warm to each other as well, and this is a lot of fun, especially in relation to the community that surrounds this couple and how they interact with the world around them. And then we have Suddenly You by Lisa Kleypas, which is a backlist early Lisa Kleypas that I had not read. It follows an author who engages the services of a companion for her 30th birthday, gets cold feet, doesn't realize that the companion who had been sent to her is actually a newer publisher on the scene making waves and who wants to purchase one of her early manuscripts for serialization. And through this, they get closer, though there is hesitancy, especially from Amanda, about what that relationship should be, and things get complicated. One thing I did forget to mention in the video about this is that it is an age gap romance in that Amanda is older than Jack, though she doesn't know how much older for a good portion of the book, and so that is a fun flip if you are looking for a heroine who is older than her love interest. I will say this is a very early Kleypas, and it wasn't, to be completely honest, my favorite Kleypas by any means. I can see the kind of beginnings of the kind of traditional, typical Kleypas hero here, but as I said in that video, it has not reached its platonic ideal yet. You can argue in the comments about who the platonic ideal is in terms of Kleypas's heroes. I personally don't think it's Jack. You may disagree, and you are allowed to. Following up on How to Be a Wallflower, I listened to, because I had hoarded in my Libro.fm account, The Reluctant Countess by Eloisa James, which is the second in the Would Be Wallflower series, and features a couple that was unsurprisingly on the periphery of the first book, Yasmin and Giles. And I did not like this book, unfortunately. I didn't like Yasmin, I didn't like Giles, and there was a sister that was featured in the first book and I thought that I would really like and was really excited to see what that dynamic would be in this book, but she is like the cartoon villain of this book to the point of absurdity and frustration, and Giles doesn't stick up for Yasmin against his sister frequently enough in this book. And it's just ultimately really frustrating. And I sometimes enjoy a cartoonish villain in a romance, but this was just really frustrating and ultimately felt pretty reductive this was a miss for me, and I'm really bummed about it. I am still holding out hope for the last book in this series, and I do still want to read it, but unfortunately this was a no for me. Next, I read Stars in Your Eyes by Kacen Callender, which I did between audio and the physical, and I did a lot of it on audio, if I'm going to be completely honest with you. The library holds for both came in at just the right time, and I enjoyed going back and forth. But I really, really enjoyed the audio production of this. So if you can get your hands on the audio, I would highly encourage you to do that. I really enjoyed it. This is the first, I want to say this is the first adult romance from Callender, who is most well known, I think, for Felix Ever After. And like in Felix Ever After, this approaches some heavier topics and themes with heart and hope at the same time. We are following two celebrities, one who is new on the scene, an up-and-comer, who is really excited about this new role in an up-and-coming gay romance in order to further launch his career, especially as he is playing opposite an established child star who has been in the game for a long time. Unfortunately, probably unsurprisingly, with what we know about child stars and what they often go through, there is a lot more going on with Logan and his bad boy image and why he has crafted this bad boy image, what he is hiding behind in this bad boy image to some extent. And in getting closer to Maddie, a lot of that trauma comes to the forefront. So this is a romance that does center the romance between Logan and Maddie, but it is also doing that character work for both of them having to work through some things for themselves in order to build a happily ever after or a happily for now together. And I really respect how it balanced that, especially because I think romances are one of the best places to explore that emotional messiness because there is the promise of a soft landing on the other side. And this book did an amazing job at making us care for these characters as well as their relationship, which I think is incredibly important. There were times that I don't think it trusted us enough as a reader with some of the emotional nuance, but at the same time, I do understand not wanting to leave any ambiguity there or gray area, and how powerful it is for people and readers that have had similar experiences to have it laid out so plainly and to still have the happily ever after at the end. And this was perfectly timed for me personally because I had been in the mood for a celebrity romance, which is part of the reason I picked it up when I did in the first place. And then I read Thirst by Mariana Suzek, which we again talked about in a Feature Friday. I loved this book. It is vampire fiction. It is split into two parts, essentially. We get a kind of entry into the world with a modern protagonist who is going through a cemetery. So we are introduced to this cemetery and this atmosphere right off the bat. And then we get a glimpse of a woman on the way out, and we as readers are thrust back into the history of this woman, this vampire, as she comes to Buenos Aires and what leads her to come to Buenos Aires in its infancy as a city. It is an incredibly atmospheric, thematic book, and it is very much a character study of these two women. And in some ways, these two women are kind of mirrors of anger and expectation for women in different ways at different times. While not perfectly, I articulate things much better in the Feature Friday, so I would encourage you to check that out. But more importantly, I would encourage you to check out this book. I mean, it even has a blurb from Mariana Enriquez, so how can you go wrong? And then finally, I finished my reread of The Viscount Who Loved Me by Julia Quinn for our March read-along of The Viscount Who Loved Me, leading into our April read-along of Romancing Mr. Bridgerton, leading up to Bridgerton Season 3. So we've already discussed Viscount in more depth, but of course I would be remiss if I didn't mention it. And that brings us to the end of March reading. Again, I read some fabulous books this month. I really lucked out. My library holds aligned and came in at the right time. I was in the right mood. I was able to focus on audiobooks. Everything just worked in my favor in March. I am admittedly off to a slower start in April so far, but I'm just very pleased with how much I enjoyed in March and how much I enjoyed in March. So with that, let me know how your March reading looked and if you've read any of these books, what you thought of them. But as always, thank you for hanging out and listening to my thoughts. Read something good, like and subscribe if you feel like it, and yeah, bye.